Today, social differences in America are more pronounced than ever before. Wealth and power are concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. The majority of the population faces stagnation, debt, and growing insecurity. When looking for the causes of this instability, politics and banks are most often mentioned. The labor market is often mentioned as the main culprit of modern problems. However, one key piece of the puzzle is almost always overlooked. That part represents the education system of the United States of America. The education system was once designed to reduce social differences. Its purpose was to reward the effort, knowledge, and perseverance of the individual. Over time, the system has been reshaped to maintain existing inequalities. In many cases, it further deepens these inequalities. At the center of that system is the idea of meritocracy. Meritocracy promises that the best and hardest will always succeed. That system was supposed to reward talent and hard work. However, over time, meritocracy has changed its function. Instead of justice, it has become a mechanism of selection and exclusion. Today, it represents one of the key factors in the destruction of American society. To understand how meritocracy became a central pillar of American society, we must go back to 17th century England. During this period, England was deeply divided, not only politically, but also religiously. On one side was the Anglican Church, headed by the king himself. On the other side were the Protestants and Puritans, who rejected the Pope, the king, and any mediator between man and God. For them, the individual had to understand God's will directly, without an authority to interpret it for him. The only way to do that was to read and understand the Bible. From this belief is born the key idea that education and literacy are not a privilege, but a divine duty. The conflict between these beliefs and the monarchy escalates into violence, wars, and systemic repression. The solution that was found then was simple but radical. Protestants were offered to leave England and go far, across the ocean, into the unknown. Thus begins the Great Migration to America. The Pilgrims did not come to the New World in search of wealth or fame. They were coming to build their own theocracy, what they saw as the New Jerusalem. In that society, reading, studying, and studying were not an option, but a moral obligation. Each individual had to understand God's word and his own responsibility before it. It is from that spirit and that value system that Harvard is born, not as an elite university nor as a center of power, but as a training school for priests. Its purpose was to educate people capable of correctly interpreting the Bible and spreading the truth. Later, Yale and Princeton emerged, universities built on the same religious foundations. Together, they would eventually become what we know today as the Ivy League. At this early stage, education was deeply associated with morality, discipline, and personal responsibility. However, as America becomes richer, more industrialized, and more numerous, it also becomes less religious. The Ivy League is gradually changing then. Universities that once served religion are becoming social clubs for the wealthy elite. These become places where knowledge is suppressed, and networking and loyalty come to the fore. Students drink together, break norms, take risks, and have fun, building strong inner bonds. It is through these shared experiences that the elite that will later lead America is formed. At the same time, America is realizing that it needs mass education. Industry requires workers, engineers, soldiers, and artisans. State schools and institutes such as agricultural and technical faculties are being created. These institutions were intended for the majority of the population and proved to be extremely successful. They enabled the poor to acquire skills, find jobs, and advance economically. At the same time, research universities are also developing, based on the German academic model. They were intended for science, technology, and serious academic work. Around 1900, America had a functioning and balanced education system. There were public schools for the majority of the population. There were research universities for scientists and professors. And there was the Ivy League as a social space for the wealthy elite. At that point, meritocracy still made sense. There was a clear path to success, and college was not a requirement for social influence. Talented and persistent individuals could succeed even without an elite education. The problem arises later, when these boundaries are gradually erased. Elite universities then begin to assume the role of the main filter of social power. At that point, meritocracy is transformed. From a system that rewards effort, it becomes a system that legitimizes privilege. However, that very system began to undermine the relevance of Harvard and the entire Ivy League over time. Wealth was no longer a guarantee of intelligence, knowledge, or real academic worth. The brightest students in America no longer chose Harvard as their first destination. They went to universities like Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and the new research centers of serious science. Those universities offered academic credibility, prestige, and intellectual freedom that the Ivy League no longer had. In other words, meritocracy began to work against the elite itself. Wealthy individuals, alumni, and old families begin to feel uneasy and out of control. Institutions that were symbols of power and status became less and less relevant. The world has come to reward knowledge rather than ancestry, connections, or hereditary capital. Harvard faces the existential question of its own role in the new order. How do you remain the center of power in a system that rewards intelligence, not privilege? The first response was the introduction of a system of scholarships intended for the most talented students. The goal was clear: to attract the brightest minds from across America. Harvard wanted to regain academic relevance and intellectual authority. From that attempt, standardized testing was born, primarily the SAT. SAT is designed as a tool to identify talent regardless of background and wealth. This move produced the desired results in the short term. The best students were returning to Harvard again. But at the same time, a new, far more dangerous problem for the elite appeared. Rich kids were no longer guaranteed passage through the gates of Harvard. For the first time, the children of the privileged had to study, take tests, and compete. They competed with students who were objectively smarter and hungrier for success. This caused deep dissatisfaction among alumni and old families. Harvard then found itself between two opposing forces. On the one hand, there was a need to retain the brightest students. On the other hand, there was a need not to lose the support of rich families. The solution was a new selection concept that has remained in force to this day. Test scores were no longer the decisive criterion for admission. A so-called holistic approach to candidate selection is being introduced. In that system, intelligence alone was no longer enough. A new criterion enters the scene, the so-called character. However, that term has never been neutral or clearly defined. Character becomes a flexible tool for selection along cultural, class, and ethnic lines. The system is specifically designed to limit access to academically dominant groups. At first it was Jews, and later Asian students. The essence of the new system relied on two key principles. The first principle was the secrecy of the selection process. Harvard never had to explain why it accepted or rejected someone. Another principle was the complete discretion of the university. The university reserves the right to admit anyone, without any objective explanation. In this way, mere academic results cease to be decisive. They are not looking for students who guarantee stable and predictable success. Candidates with a specific psychological profile and extreme ambition are selected. These are often people with trauma, insecurity, and an obsessive need to prove themselves. Their chances of success are less, but when they do, their success is spectacular. The logic of the system is simple and brutal. 10 global symbols of power rather than 1,000 steadily successful professionals. Because those 10 people build the reputation and brand of the institution, getting into this system requires a lot more than just intelligence. It takes the right high school, the right parenting, and constant competition. An insatiable hunger for success, instilled from early childhood, is necessary. Education then ceases to be a path of personal development. It becomes a filter through which future social power is selected. In earlier stages of American society, college was not a requirement for historical success. Washington and Lincoln did not make it through the Ivy League. Today, a similar level of social influence is almost impossible without these institutions. At that point, meritocracy ceases to be an ideal. It becomes a mechanism for the selection and reproduction of the elite. Today, the richest and most influential people in America, almost without exception, come from the same universities. Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Yale, and Princeton are no longer just educational institutions. These institutions have become the main centers of power, where the political, economic, and cultural elite are formed. They don't just possess wealth. They have the power to determine the direction of society through finance and politics. Their decisions affect the lives of millions of people who will never have access to those circles of power. Harvard today has an endowment of about $40 billion, more than the budgets of many countries. Harvard alumni make up the largest number of American billionaires, at least 127. About 7% of Americans with a net worth of more than $100 million graduated from Harvard. A similar pattern holds for other elite universities across the country. In other words, wealth, power, and education have merged into a closed and self-perpetuating circle. But this is not the case for most students attending college in America. Over the past few decades, the number of Americans with college degrees has grown significantly. Today, about a third of Americans have completed higher education. At the same time, the USA is among the countries with the greatest economic inequality in the world. The increase in education has not reduced inequality. In fact, it has only deepened the gap in society. Universities have become extremely expensive, and tuition fees are constantly rising. Student loans are exploding, and debt follows people decades after graduation. Unlike other debts, student loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. In some cases, the debt is even passed down to the next generation. For most students, college has ceased to be an investment in the future. It has become a financial trap. A degree alone no longer guarantees success in life or career. Success now depends on membership in elite social networks and clubs. At Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, the key is who you belong to and who you know. This is most clearly seen during the financial crisis of 2008. The crisis was caused by graduates of elite universities, connected through banks and investment funds. Corruption, abuse of the system, and risky behavior have brought the world to the brink of economic collapse. When the system broke, these same people were called in to save it. The same universities, the same circles of power, they controlled the solution. The result was predictable. The banks were not punished, and the costs were borne by the rest of society. Investment funds did not bear the consequences of their mistakes or risky decisions. This is the essence of moral hazard. An elite that does not bear the consequences continues to repeat mistakes. Meanwhile, the education system is falling apart from within, and the focus is solely on grades. Error is no longer part of the learning process. It becomes unacceptable and punishable. Students turn into traumatized robots, focused solely on success. Curiosity, critical thinking, and creativity are suppressed and marginalized. The position of poor students at elite universities is particularly tragic. They are often the most ambitious, disciplined, and deeply traumatized. But without social connections, family capital, and a safety net, their success is not guaranteed. Meritocracy promises that effort is enough, but reality shows that it is not. Before this system, college was not a prerequisite for success and influence in society. Values, character, and the ability to learn from mistakes were emphasized. Today, falling is not allowed, because failure means dropping out of the race and losing chances. Meritocracy ceases to be an ideal and becomes an instrument of elite reproduction. It legitimizes the power of the rich and destroys social cohesion. This is precisely where the root of today's political and social conflicts in America lies.